The name Big Meech has been in rap lyrics by Drake, Lil Wayne, and Jay-Z. It has been on a Starz television series seen by millions. It has been synonymous for over 2 decades with one man, Demetrius Flenory, the Black Mafia Family boss, currently sitting in federal prison. But Flenory is not the original Big Meech. The original was a man from Detroit's Brewster Douglas projects who came out of federal prison in 1985, built one of the most sophisticated cocaine empires the Motor City had ever seen, dressed in $15,000 to $20,000 Italian suits, opened legitimate businesses that Fortune 500 companies wanted to buy, and was murdered 5 years later while shopping for socks. Not metaphorically shopping for socks, actually shopping for socks. Ralph Lauren, designer. In his right pocket, $17,000 in cash. In his left, a loaded .32 caliber pistol he never got to use. Shot twice in the back of the head in the sock aisle of the Broadway department store, 2 blocks from Detroit Police Headquarters at 4 in the afternoon. His name was Demetrius Holloway. Flenory studied his blueprint, borrowed his title, took his whole philosophy, and ran it into the next generation. But the original was Holloway, and almost nobody outside of Detroit knows his name. This is the story of how he built it and how he lost it. But first, you need to see how he died. October 8th, 1990, 4 in the afternoon, downtown Detroit, 2 blocks from police headquarters. A man walks into the Broadway department store. He is not here for the fall collection. He is dressed down today. No $15,000 Italian suit, no diamonds, no gold, just blue sweatpants, a red leather jacket, and clean white sneakers. In his right pocket, $17,000 in cash. In his left, a loaded .32 caliber pistol. He is browsing socks. Ralph Lauren, designer. He picks up a pair and moves toward the front counter. He never sees it coming. Lester Milton walks up behind him, calm, no hesitation, raises his gun, 2 shots to the back of the head. Demetrius Holloway drops. The socks fall from his hands. Milton snaps his fingers, says 2 words, "Got him." Then he turns and walks toward the exit, whistling like a man who just bought a pair of shoes. Outside, his brother Tommy sits behind the wheel of a black BMW, engine running. They pull away and disappear into Detroit traffic. The most powerful cocaine dealer in the city dies on the linoleum floor of a clothing store. $17,000 in his pocket, a gun he never got to use, dead at 32. 10 years later, the Milton brothers will be convicted of carrying out the murder. But here is the question that nobody has ever been able to answer with certainty. Who gave the order? Was it the prison boss who felt he was owed, the rival dealer whose beef had been burning for years, the enforcement crew that decided the boss was worth more dead than alive, or the lieutenant who wanted the throne for himself? This is the story of Demetrius Holloway, Detroit's original Big Meech, the businessman gangster who built one of the most sophisticated cocaine empires the Motor City had ever seen, dressed better than any man on his block had any right to, and somehow lost everything over a pair of socks. To understand Demetrius Holloway, you have to understand what Detroit was by the time he came of age. The city had been in managed decline since the 1967 riots, when 5 days of uprising left 43 people dead and entire blocks of the east side smoldering. The auto industry that had made Detroit the arsenal of democracy, the city where working class men could earn a middle class life on the assembly line, was shedding jobs by the tens of thousands as manufacturers automated and moved operations elsewhere. White flight had gutted the tax base. The population was hemorrhaging, and the neighborhoods left behind, particularly on the east side, were coping with unemployment, crumbling infrastructure, and a complete absence of the kind of legitimate economic opportunity that might have pointed young men in another direction. Holloway was born in 1958 and grew up in the Brewster Douglas projects on Detroit's east side, the same towers that would become a symbol of the city's descent. By 1990, those buildings would be only 36% occupied, with 80% of residents living below the poverty line. That was the landscape Holloway was shaped by. That was the starting point. His mother was a mail carrier for the U.S. Postal Service. He went to school. He reportedly wore suits to class even as a teenager, which tells you something about who he already thought he was and who he intended to become. On the same east side streets, 2 other boys were growing up with their own ambitions. Richard Carter, who would one day be known everywhere as Maserati Rick, and Thomas Hearns, who would become a world champion boxer. 3 kids from the same neighborhood, same streets, same starting line, 3 completely different roads out. Hearns found his in the ring at the Kronk Gym. Carter and Holloway found theirs somewhere else entirely. In 1979, Holloway was working briefly as a postal clerk on Detroit's east side. The clock-punching life did not last. That same year, he picked up a federal conviction for interstate transportation of stolen goods, and he went away for 5 years, serving his time in Chicago. When he walked out in 1985, he was 27 years old, and he already knew exactly what he was going to do. While he was inside, he had been mentored by 2 men who knew the game better than almost anyone in Detroit. Frank Nitty Usher and James Red Freeman were both connected to Murder Row, the street gang that had been the enforcement wing of Detroit's black organized crime before its implosion in the early 1980s. Murder Row had functioned almost like a subsidiary of the old mob, structured hierarchically, moving heroin out of Amsterdam through New York and into Detroit. The gang collapsed after an internal feud and a massacre at the Michigan Federated Democratic Social Club in 1979, but the men who survived it carried the knowledge, and they passed some of that knowledge to Demetrius Holloway. He also had a connection that most men coming out of prison could only dream about. Wayman Kincaid, known in the streets as World Benji, the reputed #1 shot caller for the entire non-Muslim black prison population in Michigan, had helped Holloway make connections and get on his feet after his release. FBI records would later allege that Kincaid expected a return on that investment. He felt entitled to a piece of what Holloway built. Holloway, when the moment came, refused. That refusal would eventually contribute to his death. But none of that was visible yet in 1985. What was visible was a man moving with uncommon speed and uncommon intelligence. Retired DEA Bureau Chief Bob DeFall spent years trying to track Holloway's operation. Years later, he described what it looked like from the outside. Holloway came into the picture like a hurricane. One day he's in prison, the next he's out here making moves, running the city. It felt like it happened that fast. We're asking our informants, who is this guy? Where did he come from? He got really big, really fast, and changed a lot of the way business was being done. What Holloway built was not a street corner operation. It was a wholesale cocaine empire, vertically integrated, protected by shell companies, real estate holdings, and offshore banking. He cut out the middlemen and went direct to Colombian suppliers in the Bahamas, with kilos flying in by the hundreds. DEA records estimated he was moving hundreds of kilos per week across the Midwest, with reach into Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana. At his peak, federal agents credited him with controlling as much as 80% of the cocaine distributed throughout Detroit. That is not a street stat, that is a market share. He partnered with his childhood friend, Richard Carter. Carter was everything Holloway was not in terms of outward presentation. Loud, flashy, the kind of man who drove a Maserati on Detroit streets in the early 1980s, which is how he got his name. Maserati Rick was the personality of the operation, the showman, the one people recognized and talked about. Holloway was the architect. While Carter was pulling up to clubs in exotic cars, Holloway was in meetings wearing $15,000 to $20,000 Italian suits, custom-tailored, double-breasted, looking like the CEO of a Fortune 500 company. The Detroit Police Department, which named him Public Enemy #1, was asking its informants about a man who looked like a businessman, because that is exactly what he was trying to be. He opened the Chalk and Q Pool Hall on 7 Mile as his headquarters and front. He opened 3 sporting goods stores, a chain called the Sports Jam. He bought apartment buildings downtown and managed them through a company called Renters Paradise. He purchased acres of land in Alabama. By 1990, Foot Locker was in talks to buy the Sports Jam chain for tens of millions of dollars. Holloway generated $17,000 a month in legal income from his legitimate businesses alone. His lawyer, Steve Fishman, who defended him through multiple cases, later reflected, if Demetrius had been brought up under different circumstances, he could have been a business mogul or CEO of a major corporation. He had natural qualities that would have translated to the legitimate world. DeFile put it plainly, the money he was making was spread out all over the place. It was very difficult for us to track. The guy could have taught a class on how to make your dirty money work for you and become clean money. Always a private jet on standby. Vegas every weekend, Atlantic City, Caesar's Palace, the dice tables and the blackjack, winning or losing millions in single sittings. It didn't matter, there was always more. He traveled with Tommy Hearns sometimes, his childhood friend who became a champion, two kids from the east side who made it out just on different paths. They would show up to fights together, Holloway in his suit and Hearns with his belts. By 1986, the operation had grown large enough to need serious muscle. You cannot move hundreds of kilos a week across 3 states without people who can make other people afraid. So one night, downtown Detroit, at a nightclub, Holloway made the introduction that would define the rest of his life. 4 brothers, the Browns, Reginald called Rockin' Reggie, Terrence called Boogaloo, Ezra called Wizard, Gregory called Ghost. They called themselves the Best Friends. They wore t-shirts with Best Friends embroidered across the front. They drove matching BMWs and custom Suzuki Samurais. They were 6'2", over 200 pounds each, and they were not businessmen. They were killers, known for their brutality. Contract hits ran $10,000 to $30,000. Authorities would eventually attribute over 80 murders to the Best Friends gang. Some say the real number is higher. Holloway put them on payroll, gave them territory, gave them power, made them his official enforcement unit. It was the biggest mistake of his life, not immediately. For a while, it worked. The Browns kept rivals in check, kept the operation secure, kept the money flowing. But the Best Friends were not the type of men who stayed in their lane indefinitely. As Scott Bernstein, the Detroit mob historian who has covered these events more closely than almost anyone, explained, by the end of 86 or early 87, they were saying to themselves, why let all the other guys make all the money in this? Why don't we kill the bosses and become drug kingpins? The Browns had decided they no longer wanted to work for Holloway and Carter. They wanted to be Holloway and Carter. December 20th, 1986, Saturday night, Mack Avenue near the 7th Police Precinct. Ezra Wizard Brown sits in a Chevy Blazer with his younger brother Boogaloo, engine running, just talking. A car pulls up alongside them. Gunfire tears through the window. Wizard is hit in the head and killed instantly. Dead at 24. Boogaloo is shot too but survives. He grabs a brick from the floor, kicks open the car door, stumbles toward the precinct, and throws the brick through the window. Glass shatters. Police come running. 1 week later, December 27th, Gregory Ghost Brown buries his brother. He wears a white tuxedo to the cemetery, custom silk. After the burial, he goes to a bar on the east side. He is still wearing that white tuxedo when he walks out around midnight. Gets to his car, a vehicle rolls up slow, windows down, shots fired. Ghost drops in the street, dead at 23, 2 Brown brothers. 7 days apart, the Best Friends were bleeding. But Holloway had a different problem, coming from a different direction entirely. Summer of 1987, a man named Edward Hansard enters the picture. They call him Big Ed. He had been a customer of Holloway and Carter back in the day, a small-timer who bought marijuana from them when they were on the come-up. Small, reliable, not a threat, not anymore. Big Ed had found his own connect out of California, a direct line to product that was cheaper and purer than anything Holloway could offer. Word on the street said the connect was Freeway Rick Ross in Los Angeles. If that was true, Hansard had access to supply that could undercut the entire Holloway operation. He started moving crack through his own network. He branded it, called it Tutti Frutti, and he was selling it cheaper than Holloway, which meant he was eating into Holloway's market. Worse than that, he owed Maserati Rick $100,000 on 2 consignment fronts that had never been paid back. Rick was not the type to let that slide. Rick walked into one of Hansard's beauty parlors for what was not a friendly visit. The argument was loud. Then Rick did something that in those streets carried a weight beyond almost any other gesture. He spat on the floor of Hansard's establishment, on his turf in front of his people. Ultimate disrespect. Then he walked out. Days later, Rick and an associate found Big Ed and opened fire with automatic weapons. Hansard was hit multiple times. He survived. When police arrived and asked him who shot him, Hansard said nothing. He would not identify the shooters, would not cooperate because he was going to handle it himself. Over his career, Big Ed Hansard survived 9 separate shootings. That night outside the beauty parlor was not his last. September 10th, 1988, Maserati Rick's car wash on 7 Mile. Rick is there checking on the business when Lodrick Parker, one of Hansard's men, shows up. The beef had been building for months. Now it breaks open. Gunfire. Rick takes rounds to the stomach. Parker catches one in the shoulder. Both men go down. Neither cooperates with police. They both know how this settles. Rick is rushed to Mount Carmel Mercy Hospital, emergency surgery, room 307, intensive care unit. Police posted outside the door. He is stable. He is going to make it. Monday, September 12th. Someone walks into room 307. Witnesses later said he was dressed like a doctor, white coat, stethoscope. He walked right past security. He stepped into Rick's room, pulled out a gun, and shot Maserati Rick multiple times at close range. Richard Maserati Rick Carter was pronounced dead at 6:01 in the evening. He was 29 years old, the first person ever killed inside a Detroit hospital. Police announced their prime suspect the next day, Lodrick Parker. Motive, opportunity, previous shootout, open and shut. But a different story would surface years later. Nate Boone Craft, a best friend's enforcer who later confessed to 30 murders, told investigators that Parker did not do it. According to Boone, it was Boogaloo Brown who walked into that hospital room, the youngest of the Brown brothers, the most violent, the one who had survived the Night Wizard was killed. Boone said Boogaloo carried out the hit and then let the blame fall on Hansard's crew to keep the heat off the best friends. Parker went to trial in December 1988. The jury acquitted him. The truth died with Rick. September 16, 1988, Peace Chapel, Rick's funeral. They buried him in a casket that cost $16,000, custom built to look like a Mercedes-Benz. Silver plated, working headlights, working taillights, spinning tires, BBS rims, a windshield, the whole thing. 4 years earlier, Willie Fluky Stokes had buried his son Willie the Wimp in a $7,000 Cadillac coffin, and Stevie Ray Vaughan wrote a song about it. Maserati Rick's casket cost more than twice as much. But there was no song this time. There was just silence and fear, because everyone in Detroit understood what the hospital murder meant. If they could get to Maserati Rick in room 307 with the police outside the door, then nobody was safe. Not in their homes, not in their cars, not anywhere. The day after Rick's murder, the Carter family called Demetrius Holloway. He came. He handled the funeral arrangements. He told the family he would find out who did it. Then, within days, he vanished. Not kidnapped, not killed, gone by choice. Late September 1988, a hamburger stand near Gratiot and Interstate 94. Holloway staged his own abduction. Witnesses reported hearing gunshots and seeing a man identified as Holloway being thrown into the trunk of a red car. The story spread fast. His lieutenants scrambled. The feds started asking questions. The streets started speculating. But Holloway was not in a basement somewhere. He was in Las Vegas. He married his girlfriend, Wanda Jean Hardaway, whose brother Charles Chucky Hardaway was himself a reputed drug figure. Holloway stayed out west. He laid low, away from the war, away from the bodies piling up back home, and they were piling up. Between Labor Day and Halloween of 1988, more than half a dozen of Holloway's drug houses in Detroit were firebombed. Molotov cocktails through windows, product going up in smoke. Steve Washington, one of Holloway's top lieutenants, was shot dead sitting in his Mercedes on an east side corner in broad daylight. The organization was bleeding, and the king was not there to stop it. Into that vacuum stepped Cliff Jones, a former Holloway lieutenant who saw the opportunity and did not wait for permission. Jones assembled his own crew and called them the Monster Squad. Not flashy, not loud, professional contract killers who operated with paramilitary precision, carefully planned, rehearsed, executed. Jones paid between $7,500 and $25,000 per contract, and he had a signature move that became his trademark. He would settle a dealer's debt one day, earn their trust, and then kill them the next and take everything they had: drugs, money, territory. Authorities would eventually count more than 50 murders tied to Jones and the Monster Squad. He was so feared that some dealers serving life sentences refused to say his name out loud. They would rather die in prison than cross Cliff Jones. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms had been building a case on Jones for 3 years. Wiretaps caught him on the phone before every hit, checking details, verifying targets, running it like a business. The U.S. Attorney would later call the Monster Squad one of the most violent, brutal, and ruthless organizations Detroit had seen in a generation. But the feds were not just watching Jones. The DEA had been building against Holloway for 2 years. RICO charges, racketeering, tax evasion, continuing criminal enterprise. They were months from a grand jury indictment. They were already seizing assets, 2 Sports Jam stores, his Mercedes, over $90,000 in cash found during a traffic stop. U.S. Customs agents in the Bahamas were arresting women at Detroit Metro Airport, flying in with kilo packages of cocaine, $2,000 a trip, every single one of them tracing back to Holloway's pipeline. He knew the clock was ticking. He had to have known. Early 1990, Holloway came back to Detroit. Nobody knows exactly why. Maybe he believed he could beat the case. Maybe his lawyer told him he had a shot. Maybe he could not stay away from the kingdom he had built. Whatever the reason, he came back. He kept a low profile, no $15,000 suits anymore, sweatpants, leather jackets. He stayed off the radar, but someone was watching. Someone had been waiting. The week he returned, a woman who had been called to testify before the grand jury seeking a federal indictment against Holloway was shot non-fatally while driving on I-75. The feds were still building. The streets were still dangerous. And Holloway, dressed down and quiet, was moving through both worlds, trying not to be seen. October 8, 1990, 4 in the afternoon, the Broadway, 1 year after staging his own kidnapping, 1 year after running to Las Vegas and marrying a woman in a city where nobody could find him. He came back and he walked into his favorite clothing store in downtown Detroit, 2 blocks from police headquarters, to buy a pair of Ralph Lauren socks, and Lester Milton was already there waiting. The Miltons were low-level players, extortion muscle connected to Wayman Kincaid, World Benji, the prison boss who had helped Holloway get on his feet after 1985 and who, FBI records allege, felt he was owed a piece of the empire that help had made possible. Whether the order came from Kincaid's prison cell, from the remaining Brown brothers, from Big Ed Hansard's crew, or from Cliff Jones, the man who ultimately inherited Holloway's organization, nobody has ever been able to say with certainty. The feds looked at all 4 possibilities. Bob Duvall later said each of them had motive, each of them had reason. The Miltons, as the men who actually walked into the Broadway and pulled the trigger, took the conviction. They were found guilty a decade after the murder, but the question of who gave the order remains officially open to this day. October 13th, 1990, Peace Chapel Funeral Home on East 7 Mile. The legend says thousands showed up, that it was a block party, that the whole East Side came out to pay respects. The truth was quieter and scarier than that. Around 300 people packed into the chapel. Across the street, plainclothes police sat in an unmarked car with video cameras, filming every face that walked in and every face that walked out. Inside, the walls were lined with flowers arranged into specific shapes. Dice, a hand of playing cards, a horse's head, the symbols of a gambler, the man who bet everything on himself and lost. Holloway lay in the open casket in a dark suit. Reverend Obie Matthews stood at the pulpit and asked if anyone wished to make remarks. The chapel was dead silent. Nobody spoke. 300 people, and not one of them said a word. Maybe out of respect, maybe out of fear, maybe because the cameras were rolling across the street. 9 white stretch limousines led the procession to Elmwood Cemetery, a brief prayer beneath a burgundy tent. Then everyone dispersed quietly. The empire fragmented immediately. Cliff Jones moved to take the throne with the Monster Squad. The ATF swept them up in February 1993 in a coordinated federal raid that caught Jones, 6 lieutenants, and 9 others. $40,000 in cash stuffed inside the hollow tubular legs of a dining room table at an associate's house. Jones went to prison. He got out in 2015. Within months, he was arrested again. Some people never leave the game. The best friends, what remained of them, fell apart through violence and convictions. Rockin' Reggie Brown was eventually arrested in Manhattan trying to buy an $80,000 BMW with cash. He is doing life now. Boogaloo Brown's body was found in Atlanta in 1993, wrapped in a Ralph Lauren bed sheet and bound with masking tape in the back of a stolen truck in a parking lot. He was 25 years old. Hansard got 40 years federal in 1991 for conspiracy. He served 30, got out around 2021, and was arrested again in Ohio in 2023 on cocaine charges. And World Benji, Wayman Kincaid, the man FBI records allege felt entitled to a cut of everything Holloway built, he stayed locked up for murder going all the way back to 1975. He came out briefly in 2017 at 63 years old. A parole violation sent him right back. The name did not die with the man. That is the strange final chapter of this story. Demetrius Big Meech Flenory, born in Detroit and the future boss of the Black Mafia Family, is widely alleged to have taken his nickname directly from Demetrius Holloway. Flenory, who has been in federal prison since 2005, is name-checked in rap lyrics by Drake, Lil Wayne, and Jay-Z. The BMF television series on Starz, which dramatized the Flenory brothers' rise, brought the Big Meech name to an audience of millions who had never heard of the original. But the original was Holloway, the suits, the legitimate businesses as cover, the idea that you could be a kingpin and look like a CEO. That was Demetrius Holloway, and Flenory studied the blueprint. The life of the original Big Meech was chronicled in a 2010 documentary, Detroit Connection 3, Last Man Standing, made by Detroit film director Flip Wilson. Detroit rapper G Twilight wrote songs about him. The name has never entirely faded from the East Side's memory. So what do you call a man who walked out of federal prison in 1985, built a cocaine empire worth hundreds of millions in gross volume, moved kilos through the Bahamas and into 25 cities across the Midwest, dressed better than any man in his tax bracket had any right to, created legitimate businesses that major corporations wanted to buy, faked his own kidnapping to escape a war he saw coming, ran to Las Vegas and got married, stayed away long enough to let things cool down, and then came back and bought a pair of Ralph Lauren socks in a store 2 blocks from police headquarters while the feds had an indictment waiting and someone had a contract out on his life? You call him Demetrius Holloway, the original Big Meech, the businessman gangster, the man who understood the whole game better than almost anyone around him and still could not find a way to walk away from the city that made him and wanted him dead. His lawyer said he could have been a CEO. His enemies put a bullet in the back of his head while he was holding socks. The DEA spent years watching him and never got to make their case in court. The killer was convicted, but the man behind the order was never charged. The money was never fully traced. The Sports Jam stores are gone. The Chalk and Q pool hall is gone. The Brewster Douglas projects were demolished. The East Side Detroit he came from barely resembles what it was. But the name Meech lives on in rap lyrics, in documentaries, in the streets of Detroit, where people who were there still remember what it looked like when a kid from Brewster Douglas put on a custom Italian suit and decided he was going to run the whole city. He came closer than almost anyone believed was possible. And in the end, what stopped him was not the feds. It was the same streets that made him, the same world he thought he had mastered, the same game he was always better at than anyone gave him credit for. The king came back to his kingdom one last time, and the kingdom killed him. There is one more thing worth understanding about Demetrius Holloway that the surface story tends to skip past. The legitimacy angle was not just a cover, it was a philosophy. He genuinely believed, or at least operated as if he believed, that the line between a drug empire and a business empire was a line you could walk across if you were smart enough and careful enough and disciplined enough to build both sides simultaneously. That is what the Sports Jam stores were. That is what Renters Paradise was. That is what the shell companies and the offshore accounts and the real estate holdings were. They were not just money laundering mechanisms. They were a theory about how to build wealth that could survive even if the other thing went away. In that sense, Holloway was ahead of his time in ways that people in the legitimate business schools were not thinking about yet. He understood vertical integration. He understood brand building. He understood that the difference between a criminal enterprise and a business empire is often just documentation and legality, not the underlying mechanics of supply, distribution, and demand management. The DEA's own bureau chief said the man could have taught a class on making dirty money clean. That is not an insult dressed up as a compliment. That is a genuine observation about a man who understood financial engineering at a level that most people operating in his world never reached. The tragedy, if you want to call it that, is that those skills were pointed at the one industry where everything you build is ultimately built on a foundation that somebody else can take from you at any moment. The cocaine itself could be seized. The distribution network could be flipped. The enforcers could decide they wanted the throne. The prison boss could decide he was owed. The feds could indict. And at any single one of those pressure points, everything you built could come apart in a matter of days. Holloway understood the risks. The $17,000 in his pocket when he died and the pistol he never got to use were not the accessories of a man who thought he was untouchable. They were the accessories of a man who knew he was in danger and moved carefully and still got caught slipping in a clothing store at 4 in the afternoon. Detroit in the late 1980s was a city in free fall. The auto industry had shed hundreds of thousands of jobs since the 1970s. The population had dropped by roughly half from its peak. The tax base had collapsed. The schools were underfunded. The neighborhoods were deteriorating. And into that vacuum, as has happened in every American city where legitimate economic opportunity disappeared and poverty concentrated, the drug trade filled in with remarkable efficiency. It provided employment, structure, hierarchy, income, and in some cases, genuine community investment. The men who ran it were not all sociopaths. Some of them were, by any measure, extraordinarily talented people who happened to be born in a city that had decided their neighborhood was expendable. Holloway was one of those people. And when you look at what he built, not just the cocaine operation, but the legitimate businesses, the investment strategy, the personal presentation, the deliberate effort to move his money into things that could outlast the drug game, you're looking at a man who understood that the game had an expiration date and was trying to build something that would survive it. He just ran out of time. The indictment was weeks away. The contract on his life was already paid. And on the afternoon of October 8th, 1990, he walked into the Broadway to buy a pair of socks, and the clock ran out. The city of Detroit has produced a long line of men like Demetrius Holloway, Young Boys Incorporated before him, the Chambers Brothers, Maserati Rick, Big Meech Flenory after him. Each generation builds something in the only industry that was hiring, burns bright for a few years, and then ends in a prison cell or a cemetery. The names change, the suits change, the product changes. The ending does not. Holloway lasted longer than most. He was smarter than most. He dressed better than all of them. And in the end, the lesson of his life is not that crime does not pay. The lesson is that it does, right up until the moment it does not. And by then, the bill has already been written, and the only question left is who shows up to collect it. In his case, it was a man named Lester Milton, standing in a sock aisle, waiting.